I think now, as there are no points of clarification, that it's time to open up the discussion. We have 20 minutes remaining to get into some questions. Am I correct at the timing there, Sarah?
Yes, we can be slightly flexible, so there is no fixed time.
Okay, excellent. But probably people have things scheduled, so we should get stuck into the discussion as quickly as we can. Now, what's wonderful here actually is that we have, rather than me as the chair seeking to ask the first question, we've got some that we made earlier. So I think we can go ahead and go directly to those and get the conversation jump started in that way. Now, for those of you who are in the audience, again, make good use of that question and answer channel. That certainly we can add to that as the conversation develops. And we will start now, I think, from the Q&A now. If the panelists could go ahead and turn their cameras on, then we'll be seeing a room full of people, and it will feel much more convivial. And heaven knows we need more conviviality at the moment. So I think let's begin with Stephen Shuttleworth's question, which has been sitting there for a while, and actually I think interestingly begins to unpack in different ways if we start to think about the notion of the document, of what it is to document things, and is that itself a question of care? Are we caring for things when we're documenting them? So we might come to that, but Stephen's question, and I'll read it out. This is for Emily. Emily said that there were few documentary records of this Irish landscape, and he didn't catch why. Presumably there are archival records, for example, of land ownership and court proceedings in the County Record Office or National Archives. I assume those exist in Ireland in a similar way to the UK. Emily, are you able to answer that?
I am, yeah. There's a couple of reasons. First off, a lot of documentary sources were destroyed in 1922 in the Civil War. So, for example, for this area, there's no census before 1901, for example. So it starts to get a little bit vague when we're heading into the 1800s. And then the other reason for it, this is a marginal area, so it's been overlooked for a long time. So because it was seen as unimportant because it wasn't economically useful. So for example, the British Ordnance Survey came over and mapped the area, or mapped the whole country in the late 1800s. But when they came to the line of cultivation, so when the landscape changed from traditionally farmed landscape into mountain land, they didn't map anything. So it was just blank, except for a few boundary lines, because it was perceived as useless, if you like. So that's why there aren't that many documentary records for the area, and that's why the community is so important, their knowledge.
That's perhaps shows up that you have the knowledge that's held in common in the landscape, and you have a kind of state-based model of landscape care that's based in documentary evidence and design documents and records. And perhaps there's an argument to be made that both are necessary, and we can't do without either one in the contemporary world.
Yeah, I think so, very much so. The different perceptions.
Nice. Let's go then to this notion of care, and I think that opens the discussion out much more broadly, and I think it's something that the whole panel can begin to address, but the question is specifically for Maggie. And the question is there what is this theory of care to which you have made reference? Can you expand?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'll try not to go on and on because I could talk for days about this. But a theory of care has origins in feminist political science and first sort of emerged in the mid-1990s as a way of critiquing the power dynamics that are associated with different forms of labor and the economic value that we assign to them. And so theorists at that time were looking at how we culturally and socially assign labors of care, housework, childcare, anything that we do to maintain or repair or continue our worlds, our environments, ourselves, our bodies, the people around us, and how those labors were assigned to marginalized groups. They were gendered, and in the United States, often done by Black and brown people, and undervalued, underpaid, or done for free as an expectation. And recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, geographers, particularly feminist geographers, have critiqued capitalism and the forces of capitalism through this lens as a way of talking about how the labors of care and how we maintain our environments and our social connections are devalued and degraded, and that we're separated by these roles of care and their undervalue. I think in landscape, this is a really powerful tool. It talks about how care is ongoing, it's iterative, it's based, like Emily was noting, in noticing the things around us and their value, noticing the needs for care, noticing our responsibility, taking action, the physical labor, and then also checking back to make sure it worked. Did things get better? And that when those actions are visible, it builds trust in a community that encourages other actions of care. So it has resonance with the way we socially connect to each other and understand our interconnections, but also in how we start to see our environment as sustaining us as well.
It may very well be useful for our audience to have some specific references. Are we? I mean, this is clearly coming from intersectional feminism. So is it like Chandra Mohanty? Is it Donna Haraway and Marie Puig de la Bella Casa?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I look specifically at Joan Tronto, who's an American political scientist, partially because she critiques very directly the essentialist idea that this is women's work, and that is culturally constructed. And we all have the same capacity for care. We all give and receive care throughout our lives. And more recently, you can look at Victoria Lawson, Doreen Massey, other geographers who've brought this into other conversations. And interestingly, there's critiques of technology that are emerging now, and how that further fragments us, and how the labor of innovation is held at a higher sort of stature than those who are, the millions of people who are maintaining databases and organizing and archiving, and how there's just such a disparity in what keeps things going versus the shiny and new. And that becomes a gendered and racialized dynamic as well. How
about the other panelists? I think I can detect strains of intersectional feminism, new materialism in your work. Dhanya, for example, is that something that's coloring the way that you see the commons in an Indian or Sri Lankan context?
Yeah, I think for gender plays a huge role in communities like the fishing hamlets, because these are pretty patriarchal in their in the way they organize, but they also have a very vital role that women play, because they are the ones who are the public face of fishing itself. They go out and sell. And when gender comes to play in this, there's a huge loss in the way women perceive the spaces. Like when I was doing my research, it was difficult to even get women to speak about their experiences in their space or what they would want. So I had to put my cameras aside and like not take notes or record anything, but really just sit down and have a conversation. And that was the only way to get them to really communicate their thoughts and ideas. And it has been proven in many cases of South Asian fishing culture that by giving more, like responsibilities and roles for women to carry out tasks, specifically in landscape management, because they're very good mediators and they're very good at perceiving resources, because the self-help groups help with financial stability for women in these spaces. And these could become fundamentally the basis of these land governance councils, which a lot of fish workers across the country are hoping to promote through the coastal regulation zones and other national policies. So definitely I see the tangent there where gender does play a huge role in these common lands, but also in landscape conservation and justice in general.
Leslie, I bet you're itching to say something here, because this seems to relate not just to the previous question of feminist and materialist practices of care, but also it's gendered, and it also deals with adaptation. Is there something you feel that you can add to, especially with Vanessa Castambroto's question in mind here?
Yeah, I'll try and give some kind of answer to Vanessa's question, which is a very good question. And in short, I think that I don't see environmental justice as it's understood and justice in urban climate adaptation landscapes as necessarily being completely different. What I do think gets a bit challenging though, and this is where I've had a lot of fights with my collaborator and co-author, because she comes from a very technical landscape ecology background, is when we're talking about adaptation, there are arguably things that are going to happen because of climate effects that we're already locked into that are going to cause potentially real harm to people, and those that have done least to contribute to this are harmed the most. So, pragmatically, there are techno-scientific actions we can take through greening to reduce that harm. What gets difficult though is then when we start to think about other dimensions of justice, especially around process and around recognition, and how we don't end up being drawn towards quite technocratic ways of thinking about distribution of harm and distribution of benefits. So I see these as not being mutually exclusive, but I think where it gets challenging with adaptation is how do you square that sort of pragmatism around reducing harm for people who are potentially already more vulnerable with these bigger issues around how do we do fair processes, how do we recognize different knowledge systems and different identities. I don't know an answer to that, but I think that's where some of the really interesting and challenging work around environmental justice for green adaptation landscapes is. And particularly, there's some work now that's starting to go beyond, we have this, normally have with this three-part idea of justice, distribution, recognition, procedure, that we don't end up being locked into that or tied to that. Can we think differently of justice? So that's a long and rambling and not very good answer to what is a very good and important question.
But it's essentially an intersectional and materialist answer that you've just given, that this stuff can't be unbundled, which I think relates directly to Gavin McGregor's next comment, which I kind of have a hunch that Gavin already knows the answer to that question. Can a green and just future city be delivered in isolation from its...
Yeah, I mean, my short answer to that would be, I don't think so. But again, where it gets difficult, and you saw it in my slides, I showed these maps which are just cut off at the city boundaries, and even when you have people in city governments who are very aware of that, they're constrained by by their sort of spatial jurisdiction. So I don't think you can, but the challenge is how do you deal with these really sort of rigid structures and ways of making decisions?
It seems to me that this is kind of reflected very much in what Maggie's talking about, you know, that actually the canal itself, the Gowanus Canal, is really easy to sort of compartmentalize mentally. It's a bounded body of water, and it sits within a development context, and yet it's indivisible from its larger bioregional context. What if we remove cities from the equation, though? Actually, that in some of what Joe is talking about, we have these same kinds of issues, perhaps that unpack sort of differently in a rural landscape from an urban one. I don't know if I've given the right way for Joe to speak about that.
Yeah, possibly though. Although I have to admit, I was kind of rather agreeing with what you were both Leslie and Tim there were saying before, and the premise of Gavin's question. And I've been interested recently in exploring a bit of the work of Patrick Geddes, the town planner, landscape kind of planner, polymath kind of person.
Workplace folk.
Yeah, exactly. And so his sense of the city, of course, was as a regional component, but of course you can turn that around as well and start you know, with the rural from that perspective as well. And actually, although I was talking about my rural stuff here, I've worked on in urban kinds of tasks as well, and I think especially in a place like Orkney, where you don't have a nucleated settlement kind of pattern, the people kind of live all over the landscape, then these categories of what makes the urban and what makes the rural get challenged in a really interesting way. So I think I'd probably not want to differ too much from where you were going a minute ago on that one.
So then maybe it's useful to go on to the next question here. Sources of agency in landscape creation, because if you know, if we're not talking about nucleated settlements, what are the ways in which people come together in a place like Orkney in order to collectively decide the future and care for those landscapes? What are the mechanisms for that? I mean, is it documentation like we spoke before, or is this really something that's held in the commons and in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen in different ways, isn't it? And I think part of what we want to do over the next couple of years is start to unpack that question, Adam, that you're bringing there. And in some kinds of situations, I think there's a really clear, sort of strong, sort of community, tradition, convention, and so on. But how do you respond to circumstances as they actually are? And I think there was another question or comment somewhere about we were saying a minute ago about climate change and those circumstances of rapid, urgent, emergency, actually, environmental change. Then actually everyone, I think, is questioning themselves and questioning the way things were more and more, which you know, I think, although it's an emergency situation, may be a bit like the COVID thing. There are things that come up in emergencies that can be creative and can be positive and can have unexpected outcomes as well. So perhaps those sources of agency now and not the same as they have been, and maybe we can open this up in some interesting ways.
It's true. If you look at ways in which organizations have adapted, big, slow-moving organizations, the National Health Service has had to talk to itself across the former compartmentalization in ways that have changed radically. Now, whether they can hold on to that learning after the pandemic is another question. But I think the same is true of all sorts of different agencies, organizations. We're all working together in different ways, and today's panel is no exception from that. So where to go with this? Shall I move on to the next question, or do any of the other panelists have anything they want to add at this point? No mutes unmuting. So I'll move on to the next question then. Okay, where are we? Leslie mentioned towards the end that new institutions and individuals, this really follows on beautifully, were appearing to articulate multiple interests. What is the nature of these actors? So Leslie, that follows on really well from the discussion we've just been having.
Okay, yeah, and so I'd shown there that the case was Taipei, but the same thing happens to an extent in Fukuoka as well, and that is that you get particularly individuals or small institutions who are quite motivated to broker links between different bits of municipal governments, between academia, between communities. Taiwan's quite an interesting example in that regard, because in Taipei, a lot of the kind of urban green landscape thinking is driven by people, and this to an extent touches on a question I've seen from Tim Collins that has come down the chat, who have been educated in the United States and have then come back and have brought these knowledges and these best practices with them. In Fukuoka as well, you have a lot of that around urban greening for cooling the environment. You have a kind of small group of academics who are kind of committed to trying to influence the policy sphere. We've done some work on epistemic communities and also now looking at communities of practice. And I mean, what I would say is that maybe these small groups are useful because they're quite agile, and they're used to being able to kind of shift their rationales to follow policy trends. But when you have a small community like that are drawing on a limited sort of body of knowledge, in particularly country contexts, that can be exclusionary. So just as a kind of addendum to that, I think some of these groups, these little boundary spanning organizations and individuals are useful, but it's critical that you don't kind of over glorify them and you think, well, really, are they that useful? Who's excluded from this? Whose knowledges are they privileging? So that's again, I suspect I'm not the only person who sees these kind of individuals and institutions in their practice and in their work.
That's really fascinating, because actually what you're pointing to is not necessarily what Tim is talking about here about maybe trying to be decolonial, but actually you're talking about resistance. You're talking about anti-colonial practices, perhaps ways. I'm thinking that maybe the Uruguayan scholar Raul Zibechi might talk about in his Territories in Resistance, or dispersing power, that these collective practices have learned to be just as slippery as the techniques of neoliberal power have been as well in order to get something done.
Yeah, I would say though, again, we just need to be, again, I'm talking about my own research here, but there's a need just to be a bit cautious, because you still see these best practices ideas being imported. So Hanoi is an interesting one because you've had the French occupation and the Soviet influence. Now you have a lot of Korean and Japanese aid that is influencing and sort of training people in this is how you ought to create a green landscape in a city. So these knowledges are coming in different ways, and I've had too much airtime, so I'm going to stop now.
It's useful then to sort of work back up the questions again, because I think there are some. There's two questions sitting there, and I think they kind of relate. Now, this question is from Vanessa again, a question from Minna, Maggie, and Joe. It seems to me that some sort of work in the landscape, now this could also be the work of resistance, as well as these kind of collective works, in the landscape is central to all your presentations, and that work may help to create specific relations with the landscape, such as care. But to what extent is landscape also defined by the works as in the plural, and presumably individual works and collective works, and tasks that happen upon it? And what is the implication of that for considering what is a just landscape? Is justice actually held in the works itself, perhaps, as a way to extend that question? Which one of you would like to? Maggie, I have a hunch you might be able to start us on this one.
There's so much there. It's such a great series of questions. I think, yes, so there's such a strong connection in terms of how we, and it gets back to how we check in to make sure that care is happening for all who are involved. And that's where I think the Gowanus, for me, is interesting because of this ever expanding lens to say, you know, we started out being focused just at the canal's edge as an environmental group. It expanded to be about the neighborhood and these larger environmental justice issues. And then from there, we saw this larger social context that we're contributing to in both good and bad ways. And so when we recognize the larger impacts of our actions and the unintended consequences, and then start to pick up the needed care actions associated with the unintended consequences, the care keeps expanding and our sphere of influence keeps expanding so that it becomes a series of interconnected care actions. And I think that's also where the visibility becomes a way of signaling that care is taking place, that this is a space that is cared for, these are people who are cared for, and again, foregrounding that interconnection. I think the theory also, in some ways, is in contrast to the idea of justice, which sometimes is about everybody getting one, versus this idea that we all share. And that, you know, could be a whole conversation in itself.
I need to unmute. Mina, you haven't said anything yet. I think that, you know, the question of care and practice is so central to your notions of the way the commons are worked within in the Greek context.
Yeah. But first of all, can you hear me okay? Because it's a bit scratchy. Or
You're breaking up a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. But please bear with it for now. I've got a problem with the headphones. I don't know, for me, it's a bit different, the whole idea of landscape from the perspective of a Greek practitioner, because even the way that the theory is being translated into Greek measures, I mean, Greek standards is different from everybody else's. So
Mina,
I would say that, yeah,
I think it's not possible to. Is anyone? I think probably most people aren't going to be able to. Oh, that's really unfortunate.
I can have a go. I wonder whether, Mina, you could put some comments in the chat or something, or text something. But I mean, I think they were really interesting questions as well.
Joe, do you want to?
I can do. I'd say I don't want to cut across anybody, but my thoughts there were just around the sort of scale that we're working on, and sometimes what I really liked about you know, Maggie's, but the other presentations as well, was just that sense of being in a particular place. And I wonder whether there's something about care and work and tasks and so on that start in the place where you are, or the place where, you know, where you're working, or the people you're with are working, and then they kind of generate out from there. And maybe the problem is that we still sometimes think of landscape as this grand vista, you know, the whole region, the great big place, and that makes it hard to think about work and task and care in a really specific sense. So that was my thought about that one.
Maybe it's useful to go to the last question, and it might make a very good place for us to wrap up, actually, to ask the question that the webinar did at the beginning: what does landscape justice look and feel like in the face of rapid environmental change? And this is one thing that we haven't necessarily talked about what things feel like, and that notion of affect, I think is a really, really important one. So perhaps, I mean, Joe, since you're on the screen at the moment, maybe if we can just go from one presenter to the next and kind of wrap up by trying to answer that question. And so we'll call it quits with the questions there, and we'll end the panel just when everyone's finished answering the question. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's just a really, really nice question. I'm gonna stick with me. I'm gonna keep the whole question of this seminar with me for a good period of time. I don't have a formal answer, but I like the sense of just feeling and looking and being there, and there's that sense of connection and a presence, and of the ability to feel like you are in a place, that you are in and with the landscape. I think is a sort of precondition to a sense of justice, and sometimes that sense of remoteness can be so difficult and challenging to that sense of actually being in a place. And so that would be my starting point, at least, for how to address that question.
Mina, perhaps you could type your answer in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. Who would like to go next? Perhaps Dhanya, are you ready?
Sure, yeah. Because landscape justice is such a huge, plays a huge part in not just the recreational land that is so often contested in urban centers, because like you said, Joe, these are not like vast landscapes, right? This is in the middle of a growing urban area. And so these commons, for example, get so contested. And like Mina said, there is this landscape illiteracy. And that is why I think viewing these landscapes from the perspective of people who have lived and like worked there makes a huge difference in the way we understand these spaces. And that involves children being part of the landscape and taking you through their areas of play or their areas of importance, or how they perceive their future with the sea to be in relationship to the rest of the city, where you would probably not see drawings of so many turtles that I did in that particular landscape, because they know that their coastal area is a very important turtle breeding area, or it's important for them to look at diverse livelihood options that don't separate them from the sea and this life that they have as fishing communities. So landscape justice in the future really looks at documenting these values, right? And how do you bring this value to the mainstream public, and who would just use the beach as a recreational space and not really negotiate these rights and uses with those who have lived here for 300 odd years. So I think that's the perspective of bridging this landscape illiteracy is going to be very important moving forward.
Great. Mina, have you finished typing, or should I wait a moment to read yours out? Okay, Mina writes, it feels to me that landscape won't be defined, but rather our perception and understanding is the one to change according to who, how, and why the works are taking place on it. Bless everything that you said, Dhanya. So yeah, I mean, I think that really relates. Maggie spoke earlier about process and working through process, and working with landscape, designing with landscape certainly isn't about a thing or a geometry. It's a set of relations. It's a set of practices and a set of processes. Who would like to comment next? Who haven't we heard from yet? So Maggie and Leslie are the last two to try to answer that challenging question.
I can go. Oh, I beat you to it, Leslie. I think what's been said is so beautiful, and the notion of landscape literacy is so important. And I think I just build on that idea that I think a notion of justice in the landscape is both about being able to see the actions of care around you, and see the interconnections that you have with the place that you're in, and seeing it as a specific place in the world. Understanding the history of what has caused the space and place to be as it is today, both the difficult history as well as the comfortable history. And then also seeing your own agency to act and contribute, that you are interconnected to those people and environmental systems around you. And that sense of agency, I think, is really key.
Excellent. So Leslie, you're the last. Sense of agency.
Right. Oh, yeah. I don't know if I can really talk about what landscape justice looks and feels like, and it's just popped up in the chat on the side there, so I'm not the last. There's Emily as well, and thankfully it doesn't put the burden on me to have a kind of insightful comment at the end. So I don't know if I can say what landscape justice feels like, but I can certainly say what landscape injustice feels like, and I'm going to use a very practical example of heat. So as I talked about during my slides, heat within cities is not distributed evenly, and especially when we talk about the role of greening and green landscapes and doing that cooling, there's a very big difference in who experiences extreme heat as a result of rapid environmental change versus who doesn't, and who is potentially harmed by that. I mean, it's a timely time of the year to be talking about that as we now get towards summer, and especially as many of us are going to be spending the summers locked down and indoors. When it comes to green landscapes, cooling, and the thermal environment, from a very practical point of view, I would say it is much easier to see and feel and know what landscape injustice feels like than what landscape justice feels like.
Very, very true. Emily, you were the first in and you'll be the last out.
Such responsibility. I also feel a bit of a cheat because they're talking about rapid environmental change. And in this little area that I'm looking at in the Comra Mountains, nothing really changes that fast within it. That's why I have to look at it over the long durée. But I think for Ireland's landscape is just integral to landscape justice and injustice. It's written all over it, from the colonization and then the changes that it was made there, and then through to the decolonization in the earlier 20th century. So it encompasses really the whole lot of justice, and, as Leslie says, more importantly and more pertinently, the injustice of the landscape.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our panelists to help us think about the look and feel of landscapes. Wonderful presentations. I'm sure I speak on the part of the audience as well to thank you all for such stimulating work. Thank you, of course, to the audience, without whom this would be nothing. And what a wonderful thing it is to be able to communicate in this way at such a broad range. Thanks also to Sarah Hobbs for putting this all together and working so hard to organize this so that it actually worked relatively seamlessly, amazingly enough. I look forward to these discussions continuing. I'm very keen that with the Landscape Research Group, we provide more and more of a platform and a set of networks for these conversations to continue to take place. That's something I'm really committed to doing, and to make sure that membership in the Landscape Research Group gives you that access. So if you're not members of the Landscape Research Group, I do encourage you to join, because we're going to try to make it much more meaningful as a network. But I thank you everyone for being here, and it's what a pleasure it's been.